This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
The time is nigh. We are 48 hours away from AEW's Sunday Night Extravaganza. And boy, oh boy, did their go-home show leave a lot to be desired. If you weren't already sold on the pay-per-view headed into this weekend, they really didn't do much to change your mind. Just when I keep thinking, how could they possibly do any worse with their booking? Tony Khan, always managing to outdo himself. Now, we do have a lot to cover this week, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with the intros here. There's plenty of rambling and ranting to get into. So if you're checking out the FSWR channel for the first time, make sure to subscribe, comment, like the show, do all that fun stuff. Check us out on Rumble as well. We've got a lot on the table for today, including a Wednesday night review of, well, possibly not the single worst episode of Dynamite I've ever seen. Certainly one of the worst go-home shows I've ever seen. Because we're going to get into that Revolution card a little later on. After watching this episode of Dynamite, their promotional tactics to hype up that pay-per-view were questionable at the least, absolutely wretched at its worst. So let's talk about it and see what AEW did to try to ramp up some potential last-minute pay-per-view buys for Sunday, which I know is laughable because, you know, anyone that already had in mind that they were going to buy the pay-per-view were going to order it regardless of how good or bad the go-home show was. All right, Tony. All right. I get it. It's a rib at this point. I know you're doing it just to spite the real pro wrestling fans out there. The few that still exist and remain watching the product today. The ones that detest everything about the fucking company mascot and everything he represents about why professional wrestling sucks today. But hey, man, it's your company, dog. If you insist on continuing to run people off and do everything in your power to sour the fans that still have a modicum of hope left for your godforsaken product, by all means, just feel free to keep doing shit like this. Keep booking the company mascot on every god-blessed show. Keep having him do the same fucking tiresome shtick he's been doing for 3 years. Just keep riding that gimped horse all the way to the gravesite. Because we're going to talk more about this dipshit in a while, especially when it came to the main event. The obsession Tony Khan has for this guy is unbearable at its worst. Borderline unhealthy, if I really wanted to go there. And honestly, you know, I could sit here and regurgitate everything I've ever said about this clown, talking about why he's an embarrassment to the business, but I mean, why even bother at this point? It's been said a million times by myself and everybody out there that actually respects true professional wrestling. But I'm just thinking about this rationally from the viewpoint that AEW is barely scraping in 800,000 people to watch the show most weeks. People are actively tuning the show off from start to finish. And when your viewership is dwindling and dwindling with each passing week, you really think you're helping matters any by booking Orange Cassidy in the opening match? Especially when his opponent is Big Bill. Big Bill. Like, are you fucking kidding me? Is this a joke? Is this for real? You got a fucking pay-per-view to sell in less than 2 days as of this current recording. Most people had no idea what the hell half that card was until they tuned in to see the show on Wednesday night. And you're sitting here the Wednesday before the pay-per-view, booking a goddamn meaningless throwaway title match between a comedy clown and a WWE reject that nobody ever gave a shit about to begin with. In the entire act that was the Enzo and Big Cass team, Cass was the third wheel in that group. Because at least when Carmella was the eye candy, at least I wanted to see her on television most weeks. Nobody ever wanted to see Big Cass because he fucking sucks, and he's always fucking sucked. He's one of the most useless big guys WWE's ever pushed in the modern decade. And here AEW is in 2023 giving this guy a featured spot on their TV show. Because Tony's an idiot. So yeah, Orange Cassidy versus Big Bill. That was your opener. On the show that's supposed to entice people to want to buy the pay-per-view on Sunday night. And they're doing crap like this. Beyond stupid. Equally as stupid was Jon Moxley doing a VTR from a staircase after last week's show, talking about how he loves the taste of his own vomit and blood. Well, he's got a giant gaping hole in his head after blading on the TV main event last week, which for the record was him wrestling that fat outlaw job order geek. Now he's here talking about how much he gets off on cutting himself and watching the blood pour from his face. He's such a fucking moron. Speaking of them doing a horrid job selling people on the pay-per-view, here's what they did to ramp up excitement for the Trios title match. The Elite come out to the stage for their regular entrance. The lights immediately go out. The House of Dreck silhouettes appear behind them before the lights go out a second time. And while we hear stomping and pounding and pianos tumbling down staircases in the background, the lights come back on, and there's the Elite sprawled out on the ground while the House of Dreck are standing over them posing. That was their go-home angle for the title match. Champs come out, they get blindsided, and they immediately move on to the next segment. This went, I believe I counted in total 47 seconds. And it was immediately on to the casino ladder match. The House of Black and the Elite disappear. We never see them again. And they never update us on the condition of Omega or the Bucks after the attack. They just move on with the show and never bring it up for the remainder of the program. So, like, I mean, not that I care or anything. I really don't. But if I'm trying to reasonably figure this out in my head, what the fuck was the point of the Elite coming out to begin with? Did they have a scheduled match? Were they coming down to do a promo? Not that any of us wanted to hear Omega or the Bucks talk anyway. But like, no, I'm serious. What was their game plan? And how did the House of Dreck know they were coming out? Other than it was in the show format. That and Tony's an idiot. And he has no clue how to call out simple details like that. Thinking everybody was just going to look over it and be like, well, okay, it is what it is. On to the next thing, I guess. So then we had the casino ladder match, which was just all kinds of horrible and ludicrous. Keep in mind, it is a ladder match to determine the number one contender to Samoa Joe's TNT title, not at the pay-per-view, but on next week's Dynamite. Because, well, yeah, the go-home show, the show that's supposed to do everything to get people excited to see the actual pay-per-view, well, apparently they had decided that it would be a better idea to do a completely random spot fest ladder match with a bunch of green underneath guys, where the winner gets a title match against Joe on the Dynamite after the pay-per-view would have already aired. Because that seems logical. So in this match, we had the following names: Konosuke Takeshita, Action Audrey, Powerhouse Hobbs, AR Fox, Eddie Kingston, Ortiz, some small masked lucha fuck that I've never seen or heard of before, and Sammy Guevara. The pure definition of let's just pick 8 random names out of a hat and throw them all together in one match. And I just want you to think about this for a minute. Just so we're all on the same page with who the real probable stars are in this company, the ones that could conceivably draw money if the people running this show had a clue what they were doing. In a match that also featured guys like Takeshita and Action Audrey, 2 guys that have been incessantly rammed up our sphincters for the better part of 2 or 3 months now. Remember that period where they were trying to wedge Takeshita into the MJF Danielson feud, and it got really annoying very quickly because it was detracting from everything involving MJF and Danielson? These are the guys that Tony Khan is actively telling us that we are going to like. Our opinions be damned. Meanwhile, who is the most over guy in this entire match? The guy that hasn't been on TV in God knows how long? Powerhouse Hobbs. Still over like a frickin' forest fire. The people still want to cheer him. They want to like him. They never feature the guy on television. When it does start to look like Tony's going to do something with the guy, he immediately pulls back from him and Hobbs disappears from television. The people are still sticking with him, though. Yet, Tony will continue to insist that it's guys like Takeshita or Action Audrey that are the real breakout stars. Give me a break. So yeah, the match was lousy. Just a bunch of guys doing reckless ladder spots that we've seen 100 million times. There's no story being told. It's just a 15-minute car wreck spot fest. And really no sense in dwelling on it because it's the same fucking thing every time they book one of these things. Of course, they've all got the gimmicked ladders, so when guys are taking bumps on them, the legs are bending in every which direction, the rungs are getting caved in, you can't stand them upright properly. Which then leads to the gravest fucking offense in the entire match. Would somebody like to rationally explain to me when it became a thing where referees randomly were allowed to jump in the ring and hold the ladders in place for the wrestlers? When the fuck did this become acceptable? Because this isn't the first time it's happened in AEW ladder matches. And again, this is all taking place because guys are falling on these ladders nonstop, and because the boys are too stupid to go outside the ring and pull out a ladder that isn't fucked up, that means that the referees have to run in and hold the ladders in place so that guys can steady themselves when they're trying to climb the things. Yeah. I mean, you remember that one time during the WrestleMania 10 ladder match with Shawn and Razor where Earl Hebner just jumped into the ring to hold the ladder in place so Razor could climb up and grab the belt, right? Dumbasses. So Powerhouse Hobbs won, which was probably the only redeeming quality about it. Of course, the whole thing looked visually ridiculous because while Hobbs is trying to balance himself by climbing up the ladder to grab the giant ring, you've got, I think I counted 4 officials on the ring mat holding the base of the ladder down to help Hobbs win. Because, that's just a thing now. And once Hobbs grabs the ring, he's then petrified to move a muscle because of how contorted the ladder is by this point. So there he is yelling at the referees to steady the ladder more so he can safely climb down this fucking thing without probably injuring himself. Because none of these idiots ever pre-plan anything. It sucked. It was stupid. And when I realized at the end of this that I was more interested in seeing Hobbs versus Joe next week on television for free versus Wardlow and Joe that's actually taking place at the advertised pay-per-view, the one that I'm supposed to pay money for, I also consider this an epic failure of a segment. Then Chris Jericho and Peter Avalon had a completely pointless match where Avalon got in way too much offense. Jericho won. And then he killed Avalon with a baseball bat afterwards until Ricky Starks ran down to make the temporary save. And then just for good measure, Jericho and the rest of the Jagoffs laid out Starks anyway. Yes, that was their go-home angle to sell us on the Jericho-Starks rematch that nobody wanted to see to begin with. And the people mostly sat there and really didn't react all that much. Then Adam Page had a badly produced pre-tape. Audio on this thing was beyond hideous. I don't know what he said. Something about beating Jon Moxley being the last glimmer of hope he has in AEW or something. And then out of the woodwork, here comes Christian Cage to save the show with a good promo. Didn't last all that long because of the way the segment ended. But when he was in there with Renee and cutting the heat promo on Jungle Boy, I was like, wow. This might have been the first thing on the entire show that did a moderately decent job of hyping up a match for the pay-per-view. What a novel concept. And especially when he got to the end of this and he started talking about how Jungle Boy isn't bred for the wrestling business, while Jungle Boy's all about making the business look fake and phony with his video game-inspired mentality. Christian's not done milking the sport dry for all the money he can. It was going very well until the blackout. And I thought, at this point, it's hard to tell if the blackout thing in AEW is a rib or if the network finally decided to pull the plug on this godforsaken product. Just cutting the live feed and canceling Dynamite in the middle of their show. I would expect nothing less. With the track record this show's been on for the better part of a year, nothing would surprise me at this point. But no, it's Jungle Boy who appears on the big screen in apparently what appeared to be a graveyard, and he's shoveling some dirt around, digging a hole. Meanwhile, they've got clips circulating with some of the recent angles they did with Christian and Jungle Boy from like 8 years ago. They also had shots of Jungle Boy looking dejected and saddened. And, well, like I said, the segment started off good. They announced this match for the pay-per-view. Christian did say it was going to be no DQ, no rules, etc. Because, why not? Maybe in this case, I can validate why the anything goes stipulation would make rational sense. Doesn't mean I want to see it, but no, whatever. We'll find out if that stipulation holds up on Sunday. Speaking of random title defenses on this show, Hope defended the FTW title against Matt Hardy for some reason. I still forgot Matt Hardy and Stokely Hathaway were a thing. I already glossed over the fact that Ethan Page and Private Party were still affiliated with Matt. Wasn't Stokely the manager of the firm? Is that group even a thing at this point? Because now he's a business affiliate with Ethan Page and Matt Hardy. I have no idea when that happened. Must have been another angle they shot on one of the D shows that nobody watches. Whatever. The match was all right. It only went like 2 minutes. If I actually remember that Hook was the FTW champion, I'd have maybe suggested they book this match on the pay-per-view instead. Maybe would have enhanced the quality of the undercard in some significant manner. But instead, they blew it off here on the go-home show in a complete throwaway TV match. Because, Tony's an idiot. I don't know what the point of it was, other than to remind us all that Hook was the FTW champion, I guess. Speaking of wasted opportunities, y'all remember when Hook was starting to get over naturally with the people? And they stuck him with Danhausen. And the rest is history. Again, because Tony's an idiot. Tony Khan, that is, not Tony Storm, who just so happened to be partaking in the next match. And I use the term partaking deliberately in this case, because it's the only way I can accurately describe the idea of her working a match with Riho. And you want to know what the real sad thing was by the end of it? It took me until the very last 2 seconds of this entire women's segment to realize the title match on Sunday is a 3-way with Jamie Hayter, Saraya, and Ruby Riott. And they book a match on the go-home show between Toni Storm and Riho, 2 girls that are not currently advertised for the pay-per-view on Sunday and had absolutely no reason to be having a match on this given show. So why did they book it? I don't know. Because Tony's an idiot. And then came the other casino match. The one that was supposed to determine the 4th team in the title match of the pay-per-view because, I don't know, I guess it was too difficult just to keep things simple with doing the Guns and the Acclaimed in a regular title rematch. No, instead, Tony had to muddy it up by adding more teams because he's an idiot. And if I tried to sit here and rally off the teams that were partaking in this thing, I would probably just end up giving myself a brain aneurysm by the end. This match has apparently been getting a lot of well-deserved backlash from a lot of people over the last few days, up to and including the most loyal AEW defenders out there that will literally go out of their way to defend anything Tony Khan does in this company. Even the AEW marks were not too pleased with the way this went. And I'm not going to sit here and deny how rotten it was. It was horrible. It was awful. It was more of the same I come to expect with AEW. It's a case of, let's see how many bodies we can reasonably cram into one match. They had about 17 teams in this thing. The match went ever. By the midway point when the ring was just filled with guys, I couldn't tell who was teaming with who was on what side, or half of what was going on. Also, sidetrack here for a minute. I guess the Blackpool Combat Club are just heels now. All of a sudden. For no reason. I mean, they jump attacked the job order in the aisleway like cowards before the bell even rang, and the people booed them as a result. So, I guess we're meant to believe they're heels. Or maybe that's just more of AEW's Shades of Grey booking where the faces and heels don't really exist and everybody's completely unlikable. I mean, I talked about the jumbled mess of bodies in here. Do I even need to mention the completely random intervals where guys would be entering the match? Was there any coherency to guys entering the ring? If there was, I couldn't make any sense of it. I counted anywhere from like 1.5 minutes to 3 minutes before new teams would get involved. It was just spontaneous. There's just no other way of putting it. people would enter the ring willy-nilly, and yeah, there was no time breakdown. There was no little buzzer or sound effect or anything. It's just, nope, here comes the next team. And, by the time new guys would enter the match, they would instantly get wedged into the background. No one ever really ran wild or had any big spots at any point. Not that you could do big spots when you got 40 goddamn people in the ring at a given time. Honestly, the most impressive team in this thing was Matt Taven and Mike Bennett. One, because they were one of the only teams in this thing with matching gear and actually resembled a tag team of some sort. And two, they at least looked like they belonged on a legit pro wrestling show and not a backyard outlaw promotion in fuck off Wyoming. And the problem with Taven and Bennett is that they're one of those teams that we never see wrestle on this show. And when they do, it's on fucking dark where all of 50 people watch. The other thing that sucked here was that I think Taven and Bennett were one of the last teams to enter the ring. So we basically had to sit through a preceding 15-something rotten teams until we got to one moderately decent team. And of course they just get tossed out like afterthoughts. Just another set of geeks amidst a cesspool of more dreck and ass. But of course, the biggest offense in all of this, aside from the nonsensical booking and hideous match layout, the winning team. They established early on that, for whatever reason, Chucklefuck Taylor and Trent were not able to compete. So who should come in to save the day but Orange Cassidy and Danhausen to take the place of their fallen comrades? Which meant that not only did I have to endure Orange Cassidy in the opening match on the show, but I had to endure him on the last match of the fucking show. That had to be a rib. No way that was not Tony Ribbon. That was a blatant case of up yours, Tommy. Take this one up your sphincter, down your throat, whatever hole we can gyrate, and take it. You didn't like Orange Cassidy before. You were going to like him by the end of this one. It's like, it's funny for one, but is it even worth venting about now? It's not even like this was a shock of a finish. As soon as they announced Danhausen and Cassidy as the replacements for Taylor and Trent, everybody knew who was winning. As much as I really don't like the group, and I never did from the beginning, the only team with a shred of credibility in the match was the BCC. They got eliminated like dorks. Claudio Castagnoli taking a backseat to two comedy clowns. Think about that for a minute. Can't find a pay-per-view spot for Claudio on Sunday, but goddamn it all, we got all the room in the world for Danhausen and the company mascot to yuck it up in the ring with their embarrassing antics. So at this point in the show, I said, I think I've about tapped out with this thing. The Gauntlet Battle Royal took about 15 years off my life. And as much as I love MJF and Danielson, I just can't do this. I heard Danielson's promo was filled with a lot of fire and passion. And, good on him. I imagine it was a fine promo. But, man, after having to sit through all that previous horse shit just to get to a 5-minute Bryan Danielson babyface promo to hype up a pay-per-view match that I know he's not winning anyway, is it really worth it? Seriously. You're going to force feed me an hour and 45 minutes of dog shit and then try to make up for it at the end by giving me a small piece of chocolate cake before you close everything out? Fuck you. Ain't worth it in my book. Not after all the other crap I had shoveled down my throat previously. And we're going to talk about the pay-per-view in just a second, but I want to quickly say this beforehand. Watching this show in full, looking at the people Tony's been featuring for the last several months now, it is so clear just how lackluster this talent pool is. There is zero star power on this show. I think you eliminate MJF, possibly Danielson from the equation. You're basically left with about 260 just another guys. Jags, as I properly coined the term. Dudes that are on the show, but they're either too green or inexperienced to be at a top level, or in most cases, dudes that are so amateur and outlaw, they wouldn't be able to draw money if you dipped them in glue and ran them through a bank vault. It's embarrassing. This entire show just felt like I was reliving one of those old episodes of Dynamite from like the very beginning. It's all the friends of the elite getting spotlighted. Like, who do we have on this thing? We had the job order out there, whatever's left of them at this stage. We had Orange Cassidy and Danhausen. And I think even Chuckle Fuck got a 20-second cameo in that VTR backstage. So he was at least visibly on camera in some form. We had that fucking Peter Avalon douchebag working a match with Jericho for Christ knows what reason. I mean, at least he's not doing the library gimmick anymore, but the guy still looks visually appalling. Like, Matt Hardy's job faction is floating around there. Jericho's faction was muddying up the show. I mean, they're worse off than the Inner Circle was. You know, at least when the Inner Circle was the thing, Jericho was the world champion for a period of time, and the group still had a little bit of potential when people still gave a fuck about Ortiz, Santana, and Sammy Guevara. The Jagoff Asshole Society is just more bad underneath comedy. That's all they are at this point. They've been a joke since day one, and nothing's changed. Did I miss anything on that? I'll skim over it again real briefly in my notes to see if there were any names that I left off that low-budget list of talent pool they got pushing right now. Let's see here. Skimming down. God, there were so many brief segments on this show that I barely even touched on. That's how lame the show was. Oh, shit, I forgot to mention Riho. How did I forget about Riho? Yeah, her frilly schoolgirl-looking flat ass was on this show, too. Just... why? Seriously, why? Is that for real? All these girls Tony's brought in since the time AEW started, and he's still paying Riho money to go out there and expose the business. Fucking absurd. Just more of the same, dude. What can you say? It is AEW Dynamite. I think the only difference between me reviewing the show now compared to a little over a year ago is that while I really wasn't saying anything much different from what I'm saying now, all the mindless AEW sheep that were propping this company up as the greatest show in the world, now we're just at a point where even the AEW diehards are having to admit this shit sucks. And again, man, I can't even really call out the AEW marks in this instance. Seriously, how can anybody with half a brain defend what's been going on with the show since mid to late last year? The shows are rotten virtually every week. There's nobody on the show worth giving a fuck about, outside anything with MJF at this point. Anytime somebody starts to gain a little bit of traction or momentum, Tony shits the bed on their booking. That one's been pretty well documented at this point. See Wardlow, see The Acclaimed, see FTR, see Ricky Starks, see Eddie Kingston, who apparently quit the company after that ladder match. That was something I don't even think I mentioned. I just glossed right over that. I had a note about it up here. Yeah, him and Ortiz just left the match at one point and never came back. I guess Kingston went out there to do his thing for a few minutes. He bailed to the locker room, picked up his bags, and walked out. Hey, good on him. He's smart enough to see the writing on the wall. I mean, when's the last time that guy was even on the main show? Can't even remember. It's been so long. He got relegated to Rampage at one point, and that was the last I ever remember hearing of him. I didn't even know him and Ortiz were feuding. I thought they were partners. But again, that's what happens when I don't watch the D shows, because I actually have a life. But, I've delayed the inevitable long enough, so let me get going with this card preview for the pay-per-view. Lord knows it's going to take me that long to run through, because honestly, outside the Iron Man match, I don't really have much of an opinion on most of these matches. On Wikipedia, as of this current moment, the show has 8 announced matches. When you factor in that the title match with MJF and Danielson is already going to be an hour-long match anyway, I'm expecting the runtime for this show to be anywhere between 6 to 12 hours. But maybe if Tony eases back on the cocaine on Sunday night, we'll be able to watch the show at a reasonable 3 to 4 hour window. But I highly doubt it. Mostly because I'm yet to figure out if this is the final card, or if they're still going to try to shoehorn a bunch of shit in at the last minute. Hopefully if they do, they put it on the buy-in show so I don't have to watch it. But I'm just going to go over what they currently have booked. I'm just going to go from the top of the card and work my way down. I mean, obviously this is not going to be the order the matches take place, but this is what's currently listed. Starting with the Iron Man match between MJF and Bryan Danielson. This was the one match on the card we knew about well in advance, before they even started doing the whole Gauntlet series with Danielson and having him run through MJF's laundry list of roadblocks. I mean, they started building this up on television, dating like all the way back to late last year. This one, I think, goes back to when they shot that angle on TV where MJF killed William Regal before they wrote him off. God, I forgot all about William Regal. It seems like ancient history at this point, man. At least at this current point, it's one of the few top-level main event programs AEW could conceivably book. Generally, I would say they've done a relatively decent job hyping people up for this match. Albeit, I wouldn't say I'm stoked to see it. But God, in comparison to everything else on the card, it's the only one I'm remotely interested in. A title change is highly improbable right now. They're going to be milking that MJF title reign for all it's worth. So, they're not having him drop the strap to Danielson this early in the title reign. As good as Danielson's promo was on that go-home show, it wasn't enough to sell me on the idea that he's walking out with the title. Now, in terms of what they do for a finish, since it is going to be an Iron Man match, there are a couple of possibilities they could go with. They could have MJF sneak in at the last minute to get a fall over Danielson to steal the win at the very end. Maybe if they're tied at like 1 or 2 falls apiece, you have MJF do something dastardly behind the ref's back so he could get a last-minute fall. Is it likely they go to a draw? I wouldn't rule it out a possibility. I just think, especially if they're going to be main eventing this thing, doing a draw as a finish, particularly for this audience, probably not going to sit well with most of the people. But on the other hand, it would at least give Danielson some kind of outing if they wanted to do a title rematch at a later date. Say if they ever wanted to revisit the feud. So it's an option. Now, on the other hand, if this is the blow-off match and they move MJF over and have both guys do something else after the pay-per-view, now that begs the question, what's next? Because now we're going to start to enter the early summer phase for AEW, and I think this was around the point last year where they were gearing up for that garbage-ass Forbidden Door pay-per-view with all the New Japan guys, which was sort of the beginning of the end for this company as far as my viewing experience was concerned. And that's how long it dates back to me being disenfranchised with this product, where people would just randomly show up on this show for no reason. Every week, the show is just cluttered with more bodies, and I had no idea what the fuck was going on half the time or who was on what side. Still don't really know the answers to most of those questions watching the product currently. joking aside, though, if they decide that they're going to run that show again, whether it happens in May or June, what are they going to do with MJF and Danielson? Do they just split off and work programs with the New Japan guys? Is there a title match with MJF wrestling a New Japan guy that could actually draw money in some form or fashion? I think the logical answer for a lot of people out there would either be Tanahashi or Okada, but is Gato going to be willing to have one of his top New Japan guys do a job for the AEW World Champion? That's a problem they ran into last year when they were doing that cross-promotional pay-per-view. That's why we got all the lousy filler matches with all the undercard guys, because it essentially became a game of politics where Gato and Tony were only willing to let certain talents lose. Okada versus MJF could work in theory, but in order for that to happen, Okada's got to lose. And we all know New Japan's had an over-infatuation with Okada for years now, so it's going to get a little dicey in there if they decide that they want to go that direction. Now, obviously, this is all speculation because as of now, there has not been any announcement that they're having a Forbidden Door pay-per-view. They might announce it as early as the Wednesday after the pay-per-view, or they might just not do one at all. It just depends. How much more content does AEW need to be featuring on their oversaturated market to begin with? So we'll see what they do. It's all just a very long-winded way of me saying MJF's going over. Now it's just a matter of figuring out what his next feud's going to be. If Chris Jericho doesn't bury him deeper into the ground, they could maybe revive whatever was left of Ricky Starks, because they were starting that program with him and MJF at one point. There is potential money to be drawn from that. But again, it's all dependent on whether or not Ricky comes out on the better end after having worked with Jericho. And while we're on the subject, may as well just skip down to talk about that one real fast, because the Starks-Jericho thing is a travesty of epic proportions. I know it seems like ancient history now, but y'all remember that period like 2 months ago where Ricky Starks was actually starting to get really over with the crowd? The people were really taking to him, and him and MJF were setting up that title match on television that everybody wanted to see? Well, the rest is pretty self-evident. Chris Jericho figures out that Starks is getting over, so he says, "Nah, that doesn't work for me, brother." And he latches himself onto Starks' momentum like a giant fucking pimple. And week after week after week from that point on, it's Chris Jericho and the rest of his goons dragging Ricky Starks down by association. And y'all might think I'm crazy, but do you notice how Starks is starting to lose more and more traction with each passing week? You notice how Jericho is doing him no favors that they're working together on television now? Just another textbook example of what happens when Jericho tries to enter the frame and work with the next hottest thing in the company. That person instantly becomes less over for having done business with him. See the aforementioned list of names I've rattled off 100 zillion times. Eddie Kingston, Santana and Ortiz. Y'all remember when the Pinnacle was a thing on that show? How close Jericho came to burying MJF's career? Even the company mascot. I'll even throw him into the conversation. Jericho didn't do him any favors by working with him. And now he's doing it with Ricky Starks. So in terms of who goes over here, my hope would be Ricky. But, this is typically not how Jericho does business. He needlessly drags out programs longer than they have any right to go because, he needs something to keep himself relevant anymore. Starks already got the clean win over Jericho at the beginning of the year, so already there was no incentive for them to rematch this on pay-per-view. I don't really see a reason why the feud needs to continue past the Revolution pay-per-view, which is exactly why I'm predicting Jericho to go over so they can stretch this thing out longer and further destroy any chance of Ricky ever getting over as a top babyface. And you can all thank Jericho for that by the end. With that said, I'm going to jump back up the list here to go to that 4-way tag title match and talk about that very briefly. Again, I've already said my piece on why I think the 4-way idea was stupid. It was totally unnecessary. All it's going to do is clutter up the ring with more guys. It's going to detract from the actual story that this already should have been about, that being the Acclaimed getting the rematch with the Guns after they got fucked out of the belts on TV. Now they got Lethal and Jarrett and Danhausen and the fucking company mascot in there, which is just putridly embarrassing. Because now the whole thing's going to be a comedy match. Just by association of those two clowns. I don't even honestly want to spend more time harping on this. It's going to suck. I predict the Guns to retain in typical WWE fashion, where they hide on the floor and wait until the finish where they can come in and steal the pin. And the Acclaim's momentum will continue to squander because Tony has no idea how to keep anybody over. And as I've mentioned countless times throughout this show, he's an idiot. Speaking of idiots, Jon Moxley is going to have his 873rd hardcore match in the year 2023 alone. This time it is a Texas death match with Hangman Adam Page, the guy that at this point last year was the AEW World Champion, if you all remember that. Granted, the single worst world champion they've ever had in their history as a company, but he was their world champion at one point. Now a year later, he's getting hooked up with Moxley in whatever garbage death match they're going to be having on pay-per-view. It'll involve all the usual stuff you expect out of Moxley. He'll probably just come out gigging himself in the crowd before the match even starts. Because Lord knows AEW loves to film guys blatantly bleeding in front of the camera. Why not just have Moxley pull out a blade from his trunks and start cutting himself from asshole to appetite in front of God and everyone? It would at least fit the character. The fact that he's a goddamn moron. I don't know. This will either be my piss break stop, or I'll sporadically pay attention and note any of the dumb spots that take place during it, which will probably be like 90% of the whole thing. In terms of who goes over, I don't really care. Moxley sucks. Page has been boring the brakes off of me forever. Ideally, it would be nice to get a break from having to watch Mox act like an idiot on camera every week, so I'll pick Adam Page to go over. It's choosing between the lesser of two evils now, so you take what you can get with AEW at this point. Samoa Joe and Wardlow for the TNT Championship is kind of a foregone conclusion after what they did on the go-home show, right? Hobbs won the ladder match, so he's getting the title shot on next week's television show. Because fuck the pay-per-view, right? Joe was out there on commentary the whole time, and they did the stare down with Hobbs and Joe at the end before Wardlow came out and attempted to remind everybody of what the actual title match was for Sunday. So, I mean, unless I'm just a goddamn fool, did they not just inadvertently give away the finish to the pay-per-view? Is it not totally obvious now who's winning? Joe's going over, which, in that case, as I've been saying for a while now, sucks to be Wardlow. God, they ought to just get that printed on a t-shirt and start selling it on AEW Shop. Boy, howdy. You want to talk about a fall from grace. Wardlow's world, huh? Oh, that world is quickly crumbling before our very eyes. Not that the Joe Wardlow feud was doing that much for me to begin with. I mean, the whole story they drummed up with Wardlow talking about his father, trying to come up with a story for why we should care about this feud. I mean, the effort was there, but is it too little too late? Has the ship finally sailed on Wardlow? I think it has, unfortunately. They had their chance. They dropped the ball. Tony dropped the ball. And Wardlow is just another dude. Probably buying his time, waiting for WWE to pick him up next year when his contract finally expires. And maybe he'll be better off for it. We've already talked about Jericho and Starks, so I'm going to quickly skim over the three-way women's match. Haven't been paying all that close attention to this title program on TV. It's Saraya, Ruby Soho, and Jamie Hayter. Hayter's the champion. Saraya's a heel, I think. I have no idea what Ruby is. Like I said on the Dynamite review, their go-home angle to promote this match for the pay-per-view was by booking a Riho-Tony Storm match, which had nothing to do with anything. And between that and the fact that I have no idea who's on what side or what the fuck has been going on in this entire program since it started, I don't care. This, I guarantee you, will be my designated piss break spot. Jamie Hayter wins, and I don't really care what they do afterwards. More of the same, I guess. Trying to pick out scraps with the mess of the women's division they've got running right now. Then there's the Trios title match with the Elite going up against the House of Drek. I know they've been alluding to this match on the internet for a while as a potential option, but I had no idea where this feud came from. Okay, now, I'll put a caveat in there because, yes, if you've been watching my Dynamite reviews, normally I skip over most of the Elite stuff on this show because it's just insufferable to watch most weeks. But when did they ever tease this match happening on TV? The last I remember seeing of the House of Drek, wasn't it Buddy Matthews doing a job to Darby Allin in a random match when he was still the TNT champion? Now all of a sudden they're just getting a title shot with the Beta Bucks and Omega because, I don't know, they need three guys to face at the pay-per-view, I guess. And as I've already talked about with the Elite Trios matches, if you're into that kind of ring style, you're probably going to have a field day with this one. But I've seen their style of match. It's the same thing every goddamn time. Just a 20-minute springboard jack-off session. The matches are always unmemorable because they throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at it. And once it's over, you instantly forget half of what you saw. I expect no different here. It'll be nonsensical. It'll have a million angles. No one will tag in or out. There won't be any distinct person to cheer or boo. There won't be any psychology to what goes on. The whole thing will just be a complete mess. So, the usual from the Elite. Nothing new, nothing less. And then there's Christian Cage and Jungle Boy to round out the card, which is a feud that I think they've been building up since the cavemen started learning how to carve letters into rocks. My God, seriously. How long does this date back to? October or November of the previous year? Maybe even before that, now that I think of it. When the fuck did Christian turn on Jungle Boy? Didn't that happen in, like, the summer of last year? And look, man, I'm all for long-term storytelling when it's done right, but this wasn't even good long-term storytelling. Christian was gone for months, never heard a peep out of him. Jungle Boy was doing a meaningless makeshift thing with Hook that lasted all of like 3 weeks. Then they dropped all of that. Christian randomly showed back up to do an angle with Jungle Boy, and now I guess we're just supposed to care about them relaunching this program after it's lost all the momentum. I mean, I remember complaining about them dropping the ball with this thing last year when they kept making Jungle Boy out to look like an idiot on television every week. And his promos were just horrible. They did that whole thing with him and the dinosaur where, honestly, it kind of distracted and led to absolutely nothing. Oh, no, that's a lie. They had a cage match at one of the pay-per-views, right? Yeah, that's right. And then we never saw the dinosaur again. Where the hell's he at? But it's like, how am I supposed to care when they've dragged this thing out for so long? It's not like it's been a fresh feud. They dropped everything for months and then just decided to reintroduce it after the people already gave up on it and were ready to move on. It doesn't have the same meaning or implication it would have had when Christian first turned on Jungle Boy last year. Jungle Boy's been flatter than a plate full of piss forever. I mean, Christian does good promos, but this feud's done nothing for either guy. That's just the reality of the situation. This is just a case of get it done and move on with something else. Christian's already got a limited window with the remainder of his career anyway. He's on borrowed time. So whatever he has left in the tank, ain't no sense in wasting it on having to mingle with Jungle Boy. It ain't really doing anybody any favors now. So blow this off, move on, and do something else. Man. I don't know, man. Again, talk about this all the time. You've been watching this channel forever now. You know I'm a skeptic by nature. You know exactly the kind of personality that you're dealing with. And it is what it is. I'm just a jaded, cynical wrestling fan that's seen the good times and I've seen the bad times. And we are certainly in the bad times now. But I don't know. Is anybody remotely excited for this pay-per-view? If you are, hats off to you. But again, I ask you, if you weren't already sold on buying the pay-per-view before the go-home show, would you make the argument that this go-home show did a good job getting people to maybe want to invest in the pay-per-view that were on the fence? The ones that were still kind of iffy if they wanted to dish out the money to buy it? I don't think it did a good job. In the card itself, it's like there's just not a whole lot of substance there. And the problem is, as I've been kind of talking about here, what happens afterwards? See, this is the thing I've been trying to think about. You know, I talked last week on the show how I've been debating whether or not I wanted to just do like an overall analysis of AEW's product, but the kinds of things that I think about when I'm watching the show is, what's next? What's it all leading to? What's the fallout going to be? What are the implications of these storylines ending? Can anybody think of any conceivable direction for most of the people after this show? I'm more so getting hung up on MJF. I mean, he's already got a narrow window in terms of the potential babyface challengers he can face. After Danielson, who else is there? Does anybody really want to see him and Adam Page? Ugh. Not really. Ricky Starks? Maybe. If Jericho doesn't go over him and ruin all his momentum, you can maybe save something there. I got nothing. And you know, in terms of what they build to for later in the year, you think about it, what is like the real marquee money program they could do? I can't think of anything. I mean, maybe if I sat down and constructed my own makeshift card, I could maybe rattle off a few ideas if you gave me a little bit of time to think it through. But man, just going like spur of the moment right now, nothing's coming to mind. And the problem is right now is AEW kind of has a problem with their roster where everybody's kind of set off in their own little camps. So if there is money to be had in a potential Kenny Omega MJF title program, how are you going to get there? Is that something people are really interested in seeing? Would that match even work? That's the other thing too. I don't really want to see MJF and Jon Moxley again. They didn't even really have a good title match the first time around. Jericho needs to stay as far away from him as humanly possible. I guess there is Adam Cole. You know, he's still not even being promoted for the pay-per-view, but maybe they do something with him. I guess he's supposed to wrestle next week on the show. They're doing that hour-long extension after Dynamite goes off the air, whatever the show's called, the All Access thing. Maybe they could start doing something with MJF and Cole. But again, what after the fact? They got some potential names there, but in terms of the booking or the strategic planning of getting those guys to that level, nah, man. It's all over the place right now. Whatever potential they had to do that Wardlow MJF title rematch, that's gone. Nobody cares about Wardlow anymore. You know, I made jokes about it before, how they need MJF back, they need CM Punk back. That's probably the one big title program they could do. The one long-term title rematch that we never saw. Y'all remember, it was supposed to be CM Punk and MJF for the championship. Not Jon Moxley and MJF. That was the backup option. Punk was originally supposed to drop the strap to Max. So, I mean, if they can get Punk back on good terms with the company, if they sort of go through their series of apologies and try to patch up bad times, they can maybe get Punk back on board, but is Punk even smart enough to want to go back to that? Because now he already knows the environment. Now that he's worked for Tony Khan, he knows what he's dealing with. Does he really want to do it again? Is there an incentive for Punk to want to come back? Especially just to do one program. Because, I mean, you think about it too. If not MJF and Punk, who is there for Punk to really feud with? Somebody that he wants to do business with. He ain't going to want to work with the Bucks. Vice versa, the Bucks aren't going to want to work with him. Maybe you could do something with him and Omega. But again, is the political situation going to get too murky? Are they going to start to get into arguments over who should go over and how the match should be laid out? And there are a lot of logistics that would need to be taken into account. And I don't think Punk is going to want to deal with any of that bullshit. So, it's a conversation that we can have a little later on, but right now my brain is kind of edging forward to where we could go later in the year, and I'm just not seeing a whole lot of options right now. The show's been a disaster for a long time. And got to be honest with you, it ain't looking too pretty for the remainder of the year. There's always a potential for things to turn around, but I'm not optimistic by nature, and with the direction this company's been headed for a while now, they're not really doing a whole lot to turn it in the other direction. All right, let's take a breath. Everyone wipe their assholes. And let's move on to the retro part of today's podcast, because, let's be honest, I'm kind of looking more forward to talking about this than anything in modern wrestling anymore. So we are at NWA World Championship Wrestling, Crockett Promotions, February 28th, 1987. Our show begins this week with the regular opening montage. This one, more specifically, was a clip from the February 27th house show from Pittsburgh, the cage match showdown between Dusty Rhodes and Big Bubba Rogers. And in the split few seconds they showed of the highlight here, we see Dusty and Bubba doing a few lockups, while I believe it was Jim Cornette who was doing ring intros over the loudspeaker. I believe while the match was in progress. So, it was weird, because Bubba and Dusty are basically in there trying to feel each other out, and all the while we hear ring intros dubbed over top of it. And it's funny because, as we'll come to find out later in the show, I don't think Jim Cornette was actually at ringside for that match. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he would have been suspended during this time, right? which is story follow-up that we'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, I don't think Cornette was actually at that match. If he was, I think he got like kicked out or something from ringside. But that was the thing. It was the match that had been advertised for several weeks on TV. The bunkhouse final at the Civic Center in Pittsburgh, now the defunct Civic Center for all you historians out there. Dusty came out with $100,000, and later in the show we'll get to hear Dusty in an interview going over everything in detail. That brought out Nikita Koloff to open things up for a quick interview. First, congratulating Dusty on getting the big win in Pittsburgh. And now Nikita and Dusty are turning their attention back to the Russians, who have said some pretty disturbing things in the last few weeks. He essentially promised that Ivan, Vladimir, and Dick Murdoch would feel the superpower's wrath in the Omni. And while Nikita is wrapping up his thoughts on the Russians, Tully Blanchard, Lex Luger, and J.J. Dillon are making their way to the ring off camera. So Nikita's peering off to the side, watching them go by. And then he makes it known that him and Dusty have not forgotten about the Horsemen, and they'll be targeting them in the not-so-distant future. And then cutting to the ring, our opening match was Tully and Luger going up against Ricky Sullivan and Chance McQuaid. Chance McQuaid. Can't get over it. He's had the chance to change his name to something less stupid. Yet he continues to go with that. And between me mocking the name Chance McQuaid and David Crockett spending the entire match admiring Lex Luger's body, I'd say this made for a rather fun segment. I like David's line where he's talking about Luger's biceps, triceps, and a few other muscles. You know, just a few. The ones that actually stood out on Luger's body, which were like all of them. I think Luger and Tully was my favorite short-lived tag team in the history of wrestling. Watching them interact and work together here, I just kept thinking, man, it would have been so awesome to see Tully and Luger work as a team for longer. Between Tully's smash mouth ring style and Luger's power game, the dynamics of those two as a duo would have been so great. Even David couldn't help but mark out for them. So Luger and Tully hit a cool double team where Tully gave Sullivan a diving knee drop from the top, and then Luger put him away with the rack. And then everybody in the studio cheered the bad guys, because how could you not? At which point we cut over to the announce booth with Tony and Jim Crockett Jr., where Tony's putting over the big story from last week. In addition to Jim Cornette being suspended for his actions to Ronnie Garvin, the Midnights were also being heavily fined for each day they refused to hand over the stolen U.S. tag titles. As of this point, he has received the belts back. And when it came to Cornette, he's been on the phone with Corny's mother's lawyers, and they've filed several injunctions against the company, and they have come to an agreement that Cornette would be allowed back on TV and the house shows. This was also met with widespread cheers from the studio crowd, with a few boos sprinkled in there. And the agreement they came to was that Cornette would be permitted back. The caveat, however, is that they all still have to pay their fines that they owe the company. And in addition to that, Jim Cornette will have to wrestle Ron Garvin in a cage. I also still would like to hear a comment from Corny's mother's lawyers on this subject, but I'm pretty sure Corny will fill us in with the details when he's back ranting and raving about the grave miscarriage of justice that was his 1-week suspension. All seriousness, though. How do they manage to tie Crockett's hands with an injunction getting thrown at him? Jim Cornette burned Ron Garvin's face in plain view of everybody. He tried to maim the man in broad daylight. Perhaps commit murder. I'd have thought that would have been valid grounds for a prolonged suspension at the very least. But apparently Cornette's lawyers had a counter-argument. Maybe they sweet-talk Crockett. Back from break, Paul Jones, Rick Rude, and Raging Bull were out. Paul's still pissed that his champs are being jerked around in the Crockett Cup. Says they should be the number 1 seed, and if they aren't, he'll be very angry. Rude talks about how the Rock and Roll Express have been following them around the country, trying to goad the champs into signing off on a cage match. But Rude and Bull are more focused on the Crockett Cup. Bull basically guaranteed that they would be the number 1 seed, and they told all the other teams to get in line for a title shot, desperately doing everything in his power to not choke on his own spit. It's the one thing I've always noticed about Bull's promos. Man, that guy manages to collect a lot of saliva in his mouth when he's talking. It's kind of gross to actually think about. I also liked at the end where Paul Jones was threatening Jim Crockett by saying, if Bull and Rude are not the number 1 seed, he's going to deal with Paul personally. And I thought to myself, is there anybody less intimidating on this entire roster than Paul Jones? Wasn't this the guy getting his ass whipped by Handsome Jimmy less than 2 months ago? Just throwing it out there. Barry Windham wrestled Thunderfoot number 2. The announcer spent the entire time fawning over the idea of watching Ron Garvin stretch Cornette inside a cage. David in particular was very excited about this. Meanwhile, Barry beat up Thunderfoot for a few minutes and won with the running lariat. At which point they pitched to their commercial graphic which read, quote, "Got a headache? Stick around with more NWA," unquote. And I have no idea what the hell any of that meant. All I knew is that if AEW ever had the gall to throw up one of those graphics on screen that read, "Got a headache? Keep watching Dynamite," I'd have chucked my TV out the window. So we come back from break. Ron Garvin and Barry Windham are now at the booth. Barry's mentioning how he thinks it may be a little too soon for Ronnie to be getting physical again, but nothing's ever kept Ron down from backing away from a fight. And as far as Jimmy Garvin goes, if he's here to stand by his brother's side, then that means he's standing by Barry's side too. So he has his endorsement. For Ronnie, he doesn't deny that, yeah, it may be a little too soon for him to get back in the ring, but as people have been saying over the last week, he's still got 2 arms and 2 good legs to be fighting back. What Jim Cornette did to him was something that he'll have to live, breathe, and sleep every day for the rest of his life. But when Jim Crockett called up Ronnie on the phone and issued that open contract against Jim Cornette in the cage, Ron Garvin was the first to jump on it. Tells Corny that he's going to beat the ever-loving crap out of him. He's going to humiliate him like he's never been humiliated before. He may as well start making funeral arrangements now, because it is a promise that Ron Garvin is going to beat his ass and get his revenge. This ain't going to be a standard wrestling match. It's going to be a fight. Because that's what Cornette picked the moment he decided to set a fireball to Ronnie's face. Now it's personal. And by the time this was all over, I began shitting myself in fear of Cornette's overall health and safety. And number 1, he's a heel. And number 2, this happened 30-something years ago. And I already know the payoff by the end. Yet I was still in fear for Cornette's life. So suffice it to say, it was a very convincing babyface promo from Ron Garvin. Then we went to the ring for Brad Armstrong versus Keith Vincent. Pretty much anything I've ever said about a Brad Armstrong match. Good wrestling, nothing wrong with it, but it was just a match. It also did not help that my Peacock app shit the bed about midway through, and I had to wait for everything to buffer properly before I could continue watching. Because, as I've mentioned, I don't know how many countless times with this stupid streaming platform, fuck Peacock and fuck everything about their garbage streaming service. Brad won with the leg sweep takeover. Then the Armstrongs were at the booth afterwards for a brief follow-up. Bullet Bob put over the Crockett Cup in Baltimore. Said they're gearing up for the toughest competition in this 48-hour journey. He mentioned Dick Murdoch in there at one point. Talked about how Ronnie was going to rough up Cornette in the cage, and we would all get a good laugh out of that. And then Brad talked about how win, lose, or draw, by the time the Crockett Cup concludes, everybody will know that the Armstrongs came to fight and give it their all. Some white meat baby faces those Armstrongs were. Then we came back for another one of my all-time favorite job guy ribs. Jack Jackson and Zane Smith going up against Bull and Rick Rude. Jack Jackson. The TBS jobber that couldn't figure out a proper first name. So he just decided, well, since my last name is Jackson, I'll just make my first name Jack. It's slightly less humorous than Chance McQuaid, although they're pretty neck and neck. Anyway, here's everything that happened. Rick Rude picked up and dumped one of the job guys onto the concrete. Not sure which one it was. Hopefully it was Jack Jackson. And then Rude and Bull picked up the other job guy and spiked him with an over-the-shoulder DDT combo. Dropped the guy straight down on top of his head. Job well done. Both literally and figuratively speaking. Then we had Ric Flair out to do his thing, while he's putting over all of his accolades and talking about the Horseman being the best thing going today. The fans are giving him the biggest, warmest reception you could ever imagine. People holding up signs, fake replica belts, girls all standing and admiring Flair for being awesome. I wrote down, how is this guy still a heel? Well, for one, I guess it's kind of hard to boo a heel when he's talking about his group thriving on the best competition and valiantly wanting to prove that they're the most elite athletes in the world. It's not necessarily something a heel would normally say if they're trying to get people to hate them. Not to mention putting over the company he works for and talking about how great Crockett Promotions is. That was how you say, far from douchey. The only heelish thing Flair did in this entire promo was infer that Precious was coming around the mountain for Ric Flair. And I know me saying that aloud probably does not give you much to go on. Think about it for a minute. Consider the way I spelled the term coming in my notes. That ought to give you a hint right there. Sure, Jimmy Garvin ain't going to take too kindly to that, as we found out later on. Following that, Tim Horner bored me to tears in a completely pointless match with Ken Glover. I'm not even necessarily blaming Horner directly. I think it was more so the visual of him trying to do wrestling spots with Ken Glover. Literally the definition of watching a monkey try to fuck a football. The only thing I got out of this was hearing David Crockett shout very boldly how much he admired the Pittsburgh fans. He was quite loud in his delivery. For some peculiar reason, I have no idea. He's like, "We love you, Pittsburgh fans. We love you. God damn it." It was trying to figure out why David had Tourette's all of a sudden, but love you too, David. I always had a soft spot for you. I also liked hearing the fans chant, "Let's go, Tim, let's go." But in doing so, in order to make this chant work, they had to make the word Tim 2 syllables. So it sounded like, "Let's go, Tim, let's go." Tim now being spelled T space I-M. Guess it would have been too odd for them to chant, "Let's go Horner," for some reason. Anyway, Horner did a promo afterwards. Tried to do a promo, more accurately. One, he was totally blown up from the previous match, so he could barely catch his breath. And, well, he basically just mentioned in passing that him and Mike Rotunda were teaming up in the Crockett Cup. To which I then asked, "Oh, are they now?" Kind of came out of left field, didn't it? But, sure, we'll run with that. I mean, Rotunda's going to need something to do until he turns heel with the varsity club later on. So as a placeholder, why not? Put him with good old White Lightning Tim Horner. See what they can do together. It's not the worst makeshift combination they could have come up with. That one still goes to Dick Murdoch and Baron von Raschke, who teamed up for all of like 2 months before Murdoch finally turned heel. So he came back from break for David Crockett doing a special interview with who other than Misty Blue, the current reigning United States Women's Champion. She was basically out there to plug her match for later on. Yeah, I forgot to mention that. Got to see some girls action on Crockett Promotions this week. We'll get to that. Said she was coming home to the Boston Gardens in April to fight some of the best female competition on the market, and that's all there really was to it. Not the best interview in the world. My memories of Misty in Crockett Promotions were very short-lived. I think one of her more notable angles she did was the one that's coming up relatively soon. I think this year, in fact, with her and Cornette. It was one of those deals where they tried to recapture Lightning in a Bottle from the program they had with Baby Doll and Cornette the previous year. Unfortunately, to my recollection, I don't think this one ever went anywhere. Aside from like one TV angle where they blew it off and Misty and Cornette were not actually active wrestlers in the match. I could be remembering that wrong, but again, the whole feud was so brief, it's almost entirely unmemorable. Personally, I don't remember too much about Misty Blue's in-ring career outside the stuff she did with Cornette and the Midnights. You know, I wasn't too well informed with the women's wrestling around this time anyway. Honestly, for the life of me, I didn't even recognize that there was a women's title in Crockett Promotions until they brought it up here. I mean, I guess it made sense in retrospect, but I mean, women's wrestling in Crockett Promotions was such a foreign concept anyway. Just figured they never would have wanted to create a belt. Such an anomaly. But again, we'll talk about the match later on. This was just sort of a way to introduce the people to Misty Blue and give her a chance to familiarize herself with the audience. Then we went to the ring for a gorgeous Jimmy Garvin versus Thunderfoot number 1. And this is now Jimmy's first televised match in the studio as a full-fledged babyface. And while he's still wearing the over-the-top apparel and strutting his stuff in a cocky manner, boy, is his ring style totally different. This was not Jim Garvin acting smug with the fans and trash-talking people in the room. He was firing on all cylinders here. Lots of flashy-looking offense. And obviously, considering the Ron Garvin attack not that long ago, Jimmy's still pissed off about that whole thing. So he's dishing out some heated anger against this poor Thunderfoot fella. And it all came to a head where Thunderfoot goes up to load up the gimmicked boot in the corner, but he misses the charge. Garvin immediately takes advantage and spikes the guy with a brainbuster for the 3, and everybody creams themselves with excitement over it. The man's on a mission. What can you say? And no, I don't mean men on a mission from WWF. I mean his mission to team up with Ronnie so they can beat the snot out of Corny and the Midnights. So after Garvin gets the big W, they go to Tony at the booth momentarily. It seemed at the time he was getting ready to set up an interview with Dusty. However, he then gets word through his earpiece that they have to cut to the ring for a buffer match of some sort. Why? I guess because they didn't have the tape queued up. So we then go back to the ring for Beautiful Bobby versus Larry Stevens, unaccompanied by Dennis or Cornette. He did have Big Bubba out there with him. And there's some ass-splaining to do with this story. For the few times we actually got to see Bobby Eaton wrestle a singles match, it was fun while it lasted. Bobby kind of played with his food for a while, did all the normal Beautiful Bobby spots we'd normally come to expect, ended up giving Stevens a back suplex from the middle rope for the 3 count, at which point they went back to Tony so he could then cut to the VTR with David Crockett and Dusty from Pittsburgh. However, before I get into logistics with that, I want to stay on this Eaton match for a minute, because there is another historical moment coming up relatively soon involving Dennis Condrey that we'll need to touch on in some detail when we get there. I think as of this current episode, we're still about a month or so out from the night that Dennis walks out from Crockett Promotions altogether. But seeing Bobby work this match without Dennis being involved, my eyes perked up a little bit because it got me wondering, oh man, is that coming up already? Now, I know for a fact that Dennis doesn't end up working the Crockett Cup. By that point, they had already introduced Stan Lane into the equation and they established that team. But as far as Dennis leaving unexpectedly and everyone kind of being in the dark about what was going on, what the hell happened, and why it came up without any notice, you know, that story's been well documented over the years. I think Corny's talked about it on one of the really early drive-through episodes on the YouTube channel. And, you know, not to go out of my way to defend Cornette in any way here, but if you listen to the clip, it's pretty obvious he's trying to babyface the story to the best of his ability because, you know, we all know that Cornette and Dennis are good friends, still are to this day. So he probably looks at it now and sees it as no ill will, seeing as how things turned out in the long run. But this is a story that we're going to stay updated on because there's also a very important promo that Cornette delivers very soon after Dennis's departure. And it's one of those controversial deals where you look at it like, did Cornette bury Dennis on purpose? Was it deliberate? Was he legitimately pissed off? There's a lot of muddy territory to cover with that. Again, I think we're technically still a few weeks out from the incident, but when I saw Bobby come out here without Dennis, you know, I already thought Dennis had left by this point because, again, it's coming up very shortly. My memory of the timestamp is a little gray because it's been so long. Like the transition between Dennis leaving and then Stan coming in was such a small window, you know, where Dusty basically scrambled to find a new partner to replace him as quickly as he could because he's like, well, fuck, the Crockett Cup is coming up soon. The Midnights were being factored into that. What do I do? But I do think we see Dennis a couple more times between now and then. I forget when he walks out. It's like late March, I think. It is literally within like days before the Crockett Cup, which is horrible timing for everything. But I'll talk about it more in depth once we get to the actual departure. Just wanted to put that in the back of your mind as we move forward with the Crockett reviews. Back to the Dusty thing, though. We cut to the Civic Center where Dusty's in the locker room getting a word with David. And, you know, obviously Dusty has a check in his hand following his big win over Bubba in the cage. He's covering the fact that Jim Cornette's calling for a rematch on the April 4th show, which Dusty has no problem taking up. In the meantime, though, now that the bunkhouse business is behind Dusty, he can turn his attention to that yellow egg sucking dog, Captain Redneck Dick Murdoch, the man that used to travel up and down the road with Dusty for years. He's picked his path, and now it's Dusty who's going to put the nail in the coffin. For years, Murdoch was jealous that he could never reach the same level of success as Dusty could. He was always within a hair's reach of Dusty, but he could never meet him at that level. And now he's decided to choose a different way of life, one that Dusty does not take too kindly to. Their friendship is in the past, and now Dusty is here alongside Nikita and the Superpowers to take on the Russians and fend them off one by one. And obviously I can't do Dusty's promo justice. Him calling Dick Murdoch a yellow egg sucking dog will never not be entertaining. The tonal inflection alone is perfect with the way he delivers that. If only that meant he could get a moderately decent match out of Vladimir Pietrov. Unfortunately, we're going to have to see those guys get in the ring and do battle. And, well, ain't going to be a pretty sight. Let's just leave it at that. And while we stew on that one for a while, let's go back to the booth for Ronnie and Jimmy Garvin. First time they've appeared together on the Superstation in any capacity. They've both been under the same roof for well over a year now, and they've never crossed paths one time until this point. Right up at the point where Ronnie got burned with a fireball, and now that they've established the familial connection between the two, here they are together for the first time on this program for an interview. Same room, same time. And admittedly so, it's probably going to take some time for me to get used to babyface Jimmy Garvin. Haven't seen it in years. You know, everything we reviewed as part of the Retro series thus far, whether it's Crockett or World Class, like all of Garvin's material has been him working as a heel. So, you know, when he's out here putting over Ronnie and talking about how excited he is to get the chance to team with his brother, kayfabe, talking about how thankful he is that all the fans have been sending in greeting cards and letters. It's just weird. Like, I'm still trying to reprocess everything about the Jimmy Garvin face turn. It's been so long. It's like, I remember when Jim Garvin turned babyface, but man, it doesn't make it any less stranger to digest it now that I'm seeing it actually happen. I did like his line at the end where he took the time to respond to Flair's deal from earlier, poking fun at Precious. And Garvin goes, "I'd like to sit here and talk about Space Mountain, but everybody knows Space Mountain is the shortest ride in the park, and everyone feels sick when they get off." And he lets out a big babyface cackle. Meanwhile, Tony's standing there stone-faced the whole time, probably thinking to himself, "Oh, that was a dumb line." And then he goes, "Yeah." That was Tony's pop. You know, and then Ronnie threw in some dialogue too. Basically just reiterated what he said earlier, that he's going to skin Cornette alive when they get in the cage. Then we went to the ring for Ron Garvin versus Tommy Angel, which went like a minute. Ronnie went with the knockout punch. And then we came back for the greatest moment on the entire show. A moment that will live in infamy, simply based on Tony Schiavone's reaction to the whole thing. I can usually attest to the idea that Tony was pretty good at keeping a straight face, but when Jim Cornette came out for this promo wearing a ridiculous Hawaiian button-down, a hula necklace, wacky red sunglasses, and the fucking tennis racket, that one popped Tony. He couldn't even hold the microphone out for Corny to cut the promo before he had to cover his face. I think that's what got me was the tennis racket. Of all the absurd ring gear for Cornette to be sporting, none of it was as ridiculous as him still coming out with a gimmick racket. Saying that when Mama called him about the suspension, she basically paid for an extended vacation so Cornette could go lounge in the sun for a period of time. And to make matters better, Cornette then goes to remove his Hawaiian lei from around his neck so he could put it around Tony, making sure to follow up with the following statement: "It's probably the only lei Tony's ever going to get." And then Tony does the signature glare at the camera. I laughed so hard. Anyway, well, from there, Corny did a heat promo on Ronnie, validated everything the Midnights did to him, said he would never be the same again, talked about how Big Bubba got screwed out of his $100,000 because Jim Crockett wouldn't let Cornette be at ringside to guide Bubba along to victory. He did a scathing promo on Jimmy Garvin, talking about how he didn't count on Jimmy making the save for his brother, kayfabe. And now that Jim Garvin's proved to be a turncoat, he is no longer on the Midnight's good side. So if either him or Precious stick their nose in Cornette's business, he's going to knock him goofy. And as far as the cage match goes with Ronnie Garvin, it may be signed, but it ain't ever going to happen because even Cornette isn't dumb enough to get himself locked inside a cage with Ron Garvin. So after that all-time interview segment, we cut to the ring for Big Bubba versus George South. I believe a match that we just reviewed on the station less than 2 weeks ago. I actually thought they were just airing a rematch, but when Cornette was over at the booth mocking David Crockett and talking about pineapples, I kind of put two and two together that this wasn't a replay. Went a few minutes, Bubba won with the Boss Man Slam. Really nothing else to say about it. Then we came back for a Tully Blanchard, JJ, and Lex Luger promo. JJ's out there talking about the long party nights the Horsemen have been having, partying too hardy, that they put the entire city of Chicago to bed, and they still went out drinking afterwards. Tully put over how well the Space Mountain Net auditions are going. And then Luger chimed in with what I could best describe as dialogue. I believe one of his quotes here in referencing the Space Mountain Nets, he says, "The girls' estrogen's levels are rising and their hormones are surging." Is it too harsh to already infer how much of an outcast Lex Luger may have been for the Horsemen? Again, I like Luger. Nothing against the guy personally, but seriously. Tully's talking about Space Mountain Nets and getting laid. JJ's talking about partying and drinking. And Luger's out there talking about the female reproductive system. I can only imagine how well those dinner conversations went over with Luger being awkward, trying to insert himself into the conversation. Anyway, JJ pitched to the ring for the other two Horsemen, getting ready to do battle. It is Ole and Arn going up against Alan Martin and Randy Mulkey. I still don't know why I don't refer to them as the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. It's just easier for me to say Ole and Arn. Kind of rolls off the tongue more easily. In any case, Ole and Arn killed them. There was a spot where Ole pulled Martin over the top rope and spiked the guy right on top of his head. Totally didn't give a fuck. Just dumped him in and kept doing more stuff. Because what are concussions at the end of the day? They also kept showing various camera shots of all the people holding up their Horseman signs, which was about a quarter of the studio audience this week. I like the deal where Ole had Martin cranked in an arm wrench, and he's yelling at Scrappy, "Ask him or I'll rip it off." And of course, when Ole yells this, the entire studio erupts with excitement. They're like, "Fuck yeah, Ole, rip it off, rip it off." Meanwhile, JJ's on the floor egging Ole and Arn to just keep beating the piss out of these poor guys. Finally, after much decimation, Arn plans Martin with the gourd buster. Ole gives him a flying knee drop to the bad arm and then submits him with an arm bar. I wrote down, best squash of all time. And if this was designed to make Ole and Arn heels in any way, it was also single-handedly the worst squash of all time. And immediately following that, we go back to the booth where JJ is raving about the Horsemen riding with all this momentum. And JJ is going back to putting over the original incarnation of the Horsemen, just like he did last week. Talked about Gene Anderson and how when he went down with the injury, it opened up the door for Tully to come in to join the group. Ole welcomed him with open arms, while Flair and Arn were already official stable members. And, well, JJ's trying to put over how peachy and rosy everything is. But while he's talking, in comes Tully Blanchard to interrupt him. And in a very subdued manner, he basically says, I believe what Ole actually said was, we let an outsider in. And JJ stops his train of thought to say, well, yeah, I mean, he did say that now that you mention it. And things escalate rather quickly from there, as Ole overhears that portion of the conversation where Tully took that cheap shot comment. He goes over and gets confrontational with Tully about it. And as Tully tells him that if he would have had his head in the right space and he weren't obsessed with that snot-nosed punk, and it's right at that point where Ole hears that, and he gives Tully one of the best sucker punches I've ever seen. Tully takes a great bump for it. And while Tully's trying to get at Ole, there's JJ holding him back to try to let cooler heads prevail. And we've been alluding to some of the Horsemen dissension for a while on television. Haven't really given away too much in terms of detail. At least I've tried not to explicitly. But now we've seen sort of the first breakdown in communication with the original Horsemen members. And it all dates back to this episode on the Superstation with Ole and Tully. Ole and Tully. Now that I think about it, maybe that's why they decided to kick Ole out of the group. Because they looked at the Horsemen lineup one day and said, Ole and Tully sound too much alike. Let's get Lex Luger in there instead. Nah, but in all seriousness, this was a pretty big deal at the time. And Tony and David were back selling the confusion as to what led to all this. They talked about how this doesn't happen with the Horsemen. It's very out of character for everybody. You know, we never see the Horsemen fighting amongst one another. To which I noted, boy, just you wait until the Monday Night Wars, where for basically an entire year on Nitro, they were doing a storyline where none of the Horsemen members were getting along. And Flair was out there trying to play peacemaker on every show. Now, granted, by that point, the Horsemen were just kind of a joke anyway. Fucking Steve McMichael was a Horseman at one point. Think about that for a minute. Anyway, keep this in your back pocket, because we're going to be revisiting it probably in a matter of a few minutes. For now, though, let's go to the ring for Misty Blue versus Linda Dallas. One of the few times we saw ladies' action take place on Crockett Television. That actually might be an interesting trivia question. How often did women's wrestling occur on the TBS Superstation during the Crockett days? Probably could count that on one hand. And we've touched on this with the Dallas reviews, you know, the few women's matches we reviewed on that show. But this was a period in the business where women's wrestling was an attraction kind of match. So you rarely saw it, and when you did, it actually felt special. It wasn't rammed down your throat every week to the point where you just never want to see it again. And, you know, I already kind of touched on how Misty Blue's run in Crockett Promotions was fairly short-lived. Never really did anything memorable from what I remember. She was around for a little bit, but definitely didn't have a run like Baby Doll did. Tony and David spend more of the match recounting the Ole angle from earlier and not really spending much time talking about what was going on in the ring. I did like the point where Tony was not able to identify what an octopus stretch was. When Misty had Linda wrapped up, he called it, I believe, a rather unique move. To be fair, David didn't really know what it was either, but I mean, I expect nothing less from David Crockett. And credit where it's due, he at least knew what the airplane spin was. The action was all right for the most part. The announcers totally buried it by barely acknowledging it because they weren't even paying attention. As did the production team by the time we got to the finish, because while the match is still in progress, JJ comes back out to the booth to get in Tony and David's face. saying that they need to get off the Ole subject and focus on the ring action. And while Tony is trying to get the truck to play back the footage from earlier, we hear the following sounds take place in the background. A small thud on the mat, a hand slapping the mat 3 times, and a bell to signify the end of the match. Never acknowledged who won, never drew any attention to it, and before we had a chance to draw any sensible conclusion, that is when they pitched to the video feed to show Ole punching Tully in the face. I presume Misty won, but don't hold my feet to the fire with that, because I don't have a fucking clue. So, well, before the JJ follow-up, first we had Nikita killing Vernon Deaton in a totally pointless squash, and then we went back to JJ so he could fill us in with the details of what's going on with Ole. He says that things got a little out of hand earlier on, and that there's one thing JJ knows about Ole, it's that he can be a little big-headed sometimes, perhaps a little stubborn. So in the best interest of everybody involved, it would probably be best for Ole to come out here and apologize to everybody, most notably Tully. He also mentioned what set Ole over the edge earlier on, the fact that Tully mentioned Ole being away from television to watch his son compete in some kind of sports league or whatever it was. I did like his Freudian slip moment where he says, if Ole's still in the business, building, either way the line would have worked. And I love this bit of interaction with JJ and the announcers. You know, he's calling out Ole to make the apology, but he's also recognizing that they don't have much time left in the show. So while JJ is impatiently looking at his watch, waiting for Ole to come out, he's going, I can buy more airtime if we need it. I have money. And I just try and compare it to a moment like what we would see in wrestling now, where when guys call each other out on television, like one guy's in the ring, the other guy's allegedly hanging out in the locker room, and as soon as the guy in the ring makes the initial call out, the guy in the ring or the guy in the back is out there less than 5 seconds later to do the confrontation. It's like totally inorganic. But with the way they did this, it felt very rushed and very chaotic, which is a good thing. And while JJ's waiting for Ole to come out, finally Ole comes out to the podium to make it known that he didn't appreciate JJ running his mouth earlier on about Ole's son. So he slaps JJ in the face and down goes poor JJ. Meanwhile, in from the back door runs Tully to tackle Ole to the floor, and they start going to town on one another. And they're tussling and wrestling behind the curtain area while JJ's trying to yank them apart. Everybody's screaming and going wild in the studio for this. Admittedly so, it was a great piece of television. And it's interesting how in all this, no Arn, no Flair, no Luger, just Tully and Ole settling some beef like two men would. You know, everyone else is sort of waiting in the wings right now because we're not exactly sure what the rest of the Horsemen are thinking right now. What do they make of all this? Whose side are they on? Ole or Tully's? I love this angle. Great close to the show. Obviously, you see the direction they're taking things for the remainder of 87 with Ole slowly getting phased out of the equation. You know, Luger hanging out in the periphery, getting ready to make his way in. So, it all makes sense. Really good stuff. A great way to close out what ended up being a relatively decent episode of World Championship Wrestling. The story development with the Horsemen was probably the most intriguing thing on the entire show. But, you know, on the other side, you got the Garvins and the Midnight Express feud that's kicking up. Dennis Condrey's future is still up in the air right now. You know, him being absent from the show entirely was still weird to see. But, you know, there's more to come with that story in the next month. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this program. Better than the last few episodes I've seen. That is for sure. And meanwhile, we'll flip the page here and turn things over to World Class Championship Wrestling. And, well, it was a bit of an unconventional episode. Bill Mercer promoted this on last week's show for the March 4th edition of Dallas Television. They dedicated the entire program as a tribute to David von Erich. Now, obviously, I think we're pretty well aware of where we are in the timeline with World Class in 84. At the time this news broke in February, it was a pretty shocking moment for a lot of people out there. And, the story's been well documented in various detail over time. It's kind of interesting how there's still a lot of uncertainty as to what exactly led to David's direct passing. The autopsy report that the Japanese doctors seemed to indicate was that it was ruptured intestines. Although I think Kevin said in later documentaries that he thought it was a heart attack. And there's still a lot of open-ended discussion about this, even years afterwards. And I didn't directly go into detail about the story of his death and what I think the cause was. Again, that's something the historians have delved into over time. And if you want to read about it or listen to the commentary on it, there are plenty of books or documentaries out there to go watch or listen to. You still probably won't get a concrete answer from any source because, again, it's kind of an open-ended topic. Nobody really knows the true answer to it. With that said, though, because of where David was at this point in his career prior to his death in February, we talked here on the podcast about what I thought was going to be the potential fallout of his current booking. Had he been alive to get that big world title rematch with Ric Flair? And we talked about the idea of whether or not he would have had a run with the NWA World Heavyweight title, how long it would have lasted, etc., etc. And again, we covered this pretty thoroughly over the last month, so it's something you can go back in our archives and check out if you want more contextual analysis to everything. But this episode started off with Bill Mercer running down the show, talking about how this was going to be an hour-long tribute. He, did a nice little opening message talking about what it's like to lose loved ones and why you go through those initial grieving periods after the loss. Over time, you start to recall the good memories and think back to all the fun times you had with your loved ones. So they had the VTR showing David basically growing up on the farm in Dallas, hanging out with his dad and his brothers, taking part in all the sports activities, whether it was basketball, football, fishing, etc. There was some horseback riding footage in there too. It was, God, it was so crazy looking at pictures of David when he was no older than 15. He looked exactly as he did when he was 25. Just more hair. But you look at like those young high school or middle school pictures of David von Erich, he looks no different than his adult self. He just screams white meat babyface from the moment you look at him on camera. But that kind of led into Mercer running down the championship credentials and talking about how David was one of the first Von Erich brothers to facilitate the claw as a regular finish on television. Once Fritz taught him the move, obviously. So they show highlights of a match between him and Harley Race. I believe this was from Kansas City in 79. Although I don't ever believe they threw up a graphic on screen for it to show the date. But this is one of the first matches where David used the claw as a finish, and he managed to beat Harley in a non-title match with the hold. They even went so far as to have Harley gig here just to put over the lethality of the move. And they had Harley doing a promo afterwards, still doing his best to keep everything in kayfabe because he was obviously a heel at this point. But he's also methodically putting over David and somewhat begrudgingly admitting to the fact that in addition to him being a superb athlete and tremendous talent, had life not been cut short for him, Harley truly believed that he would have been NWA World's Heavyweight Champion. And again, factoring in where we were in history at this point and how the whole world of kayfabe was still very important to maintain, Harley was still in character. But you also could see that hidden message in there. The fact that Harley respected the hell out of David's in-ring ability and really admired the man. And pretty soon they cut to some footage of a David von Erich, Jimmy Garvin match from the Sportatorium. This, I believe, was a match they had taped for the Texas Heavyweight title back in '83. And we obviously remember that feud fairly well because we reviewed the entirety of 1983 here on the channel. For the life of me, now I can't remember if this was before or after they did the stipulation match where when Jimmy lost, he had to spend the day on David's ranch doing chore play for Sunshine, or with Sunshine. For that one, they didn't even show the full match. They just showed a series of highlights and then cut to a Jimmy Garvin VTR where he's talking about David's legacy. Again, still trying to modify his dialogue to keep everything relative to kayfabe, but even Jimmy was kind of breaking the fourth wall here a time or two, talking about their storied rivalry and established that they fought a lot. And if there was anybody that knew David like the back of his hand, it was gorgeous Jimmy Garvin. And from there, they jumped to footage of David teaming with the Iceman to take on two of the Freebirds. I wasn't paying that close attention to the participants, but I think it was Hayes and Gordy. Actually, it might have been a six-man now that I think of it. In any case, doesn't matter. The real bulk of the conversation comes with Hayes' promo. What I thought was the single best promo from anybody on this entire show, babyface or heel. And again, it's a heel trying to provide commentary on the matter and putting over David's wrestling legacy, while at the same time trying to stay in character and not break kayfabe. But especially for the Freebirds, that was going to be extraordinarily difficult. Mostly in that the entire world-class product could basically be built around the Freebirds Von Erich feud. This thing's been going on since December of '82. It's been one of the most crucial storylines they've been cultivating on this show for the better part of a year plus. This was a pretty risky thing to do, especially on Dallas television. Because if Hayes did anything to expose how much he respected David's work and how much he really enjoyed doing business with him, that could have been the nail in the coffin for world-class's on-screen product. The fans wouldn't have bought it. Not after all that investment has seen the Von Erichs and the Freebirds beat the shit out of each other for the past 14 months. So with Hayes' promo, he basically put over, I can't sit here and talk about how this was a significant loss for the Freebirds. We've been feuding for over a year now and can't stand each other. The feud will never be over, despite being David gone. But even by that token, Hayes always admired the fact that David fought for what he believed in. Didn't see eye to eye with him, but damn it all, you gotta respect a man that fights for his morals and values. What happened to David was a tragedy, and that's basically where you can leave it. Again, much like the Harley Jimmy Garvin promo, it's a heel talking about the legacy of a top babyface. And in the case of Hayes, a top heel talking about a top babyface. So he really had to tread lightly with his promo here to make sure he didn't say anything that would outright expose the business. Because, when you still keep kayfabe in mind, how seriously it was taken around this point, this was a fine line they were walking here between kayfabe and the world of reality. It's just, there wasn't a lot of leeway with it. And I thought Hayes' promo was excellent. Then we rounded things out with David's title match with Flair from the Christmas Star Wars from '83 at the Reunion Arena. Again, one of the last high-profile matches he would ever have. And this was supposed to be the match that launched the Flair-David program into the next gear. They had Flair there to chime in with some thoughts. A very low-key, subdued Ric Flair promo, which is almost otherworldly when you compare it to some of the stuff we're talking about with him and Crockett Promotions in '87, where he's just batshit crazy most weeks. And, David Manning had some thoughts to share, too. Talked about some memories. It was all good stuff. And, of course, Bill Mercer's putting over that in addition to wanting to grow up being a pro wrestler, David also had aspirations to be a cowboy, to follow in the footsteps of his father and live life on the ranch. Evidently, we got footage of him riding his horses. Loved the slow-mo shot where he rode the horse up to the camera so he could give the big bullhorn sign. You know, it's funny too. I see all these old videotapes of the Von Erichs living happily on their ranch. Not a soul within miles of their home. I just think, damn if there's one thing that I'm going to regret later on in life. It's not having the opportunity to grow up on a farm. The good old rural country lifestyle. I mean, albeit it ain't for everybody, but if you're somebody that values the peace and tranquility like me, would have been the perfect lifestyle. And of course, in addition to everything we're talking about with David's life, we obviously can't neglect the fact that the Von Erichs were family men of God. Not exactly sure what religious affiliation the Von Erichs were. My guess would be they were probably devout Catholic. Yeah, they had some footage here with Fritz, his wife, Carrie, Kevin, and Mike, all sitting around the pond talking about how strange life can be. Talking about how God works in mysterious ways, but even with a life taken so soon, someday they'll all be with David again. And, you know, not that this is really the ample time for me to get knee deep in biblical conversation, but, you know, especially when you look at the timeline of the Von Erich family and where we will wind up in just 10 years from now, you know, by 1993, 1994 was it? Carrie was gone. Fritz died in like 95 or 96, not too long after Carrie passed. Mike was gone by 87. I mean, out of the entire group here, the only one still alive today is Kevin. And, you know, you question a lot of things in life, especially as you get older. Did everybody's life end too soon with the Von Erich family, or was it just right place and right time for God to play his hand? I mean, you really don't know. That's why it's always good to encourage people to do their best to live a life of good morals. Even if you don't have any religious affiliation or tie. You know, for me, I grew up in the Episcopal Church. You know, my father was a choir director. I was always in church from the time I was a youngling. But, you know, I'll be the first to sit here and tell you that God walked out of my life during the scandemic when the church decided to shut everything down and remove God from everybody's life. All because of a fucking goddamn seasonal cold. One of the most hideous acts perpetrated in this world in modern time. And we're still feeling the effects of it after people have finally woken up to the reality of how much COVID was actually blown out of proportion. I knew it was, but didn't stop the rest of the world from going crazy. And ever since March of 2020, I remember that day like the back of my hand, man. I walked away from the church, never looked back. Then I started recognizing the problem with the Episcopal Church, period. And I said, glad I never went back. But, you know, even to this day, I still try to act in this world as if God exists in some form or fashion, whatever your definition of God is. And that way, when I eat shit later on in my life, you know, he can judge whether or not I'm worthy of entering his eternal kingdom, whatever that may be. I don't know. Maybe things will work out. It'd be kind of nice to reacquaint with some lost ones in my life, but guess he'll be the ultimate judge. You know, and Fritz's words were really touching too. Can't forget to mention Fritz talking about David, because he rounded out things very effectively. Putting over David and how he'll be greatly missed. And, you know, while the Dallas fans have been unsure about the future of the Von Erichs, Fritz sees it as a humble beginning. You know, David's name will obviously live on, but that's not going to stop the Von Erichs from continuing to carry on the family legacy. Talks about how it's tough losing a child as a father. It's not something you envision ever happening in your life. And in the moment as a father, when you lose that son or daughter, regardless of how many children you have, the only son or daughter that exists in that moment is the one that you lose. And Fritz doesn't apologize for kicking his son's asses when he needed to. His goal was to make sure they didn't wind up being a bunch of sissies later on in life. But, even during the times where he wanted nothing more but to hold his sons and hug them and tell them how much he loved them, he knows that even Mike, Carey, or Kevin wouldn't call Fritz a sissy. And what Fritz and Bill loved about the memorial service for David was that, they came away from it with hope, not feeling sorrowful. The minister did a great job ensuring everybody that it was a sign of celebration, because that's what David would have wanted. He didn't want anybody feeling sorry for him. He wanted everybody to be joyful and celebrate his life and celebrate everybody's time with their loved ones. And they capped everything off with Fritz thanking Mercer for coming out to the ranch to talk to him. He's kind of busting his balls for a minute there, joking about how the last time Mercer came out to the ranch, the Von Erichs took him duck hunting. Mercer was the only one that walked away empty-handed. And, they're kind of jesting back and forth about that. Fritz claimed it was because he was aiming the gun in the wrong direction. But, I don't know, maybe Mercer saw it in another way. This is beautiful stuff, man. A genuine, authentic conversation. A proud father talking about his son and assuring that even though he made plenty of mistakes as a father, the one thing he never did wrong was pushing his sons to be the best versions of themselves. Man, 25 years old. 25. During the prime of his life. Way too young to have his life taken from him. Here I sit at age 35. I still remember what I was doing 10 years ago. I was a meager, skinny, frail piece of shit when I was 25. Barely had a penny to my name. Scratching and clawing just to make ends meet. I almost envy guys like David for making the most out of his life by the time he was 25. They kept revisiting this talking point, but Fritz said it here. He lived 75 years of life in 25 years. And, when you're a man of God, man of faith, you look at these kinds of situations and you react how Fritz would. Whether or not you believe in it, you have some sort of idea that the important people that you lose later in your life, you hold on to faith that they're born again. And you'll someday get a chance to see them again in some capacity. It's a hard subject to tackle if you're somebody that doesn't believe in a second life, but, I thought about it while I was watching this, because before I sat down and watched the show in full, I was kind of having a rotten day at work. Just, things weren't going my way. It was just generally a bad time. And then I sat down and watched the show, and I felt good by the end. This is probably one of the more important pieces of wrestling content that I've watched in a long time, if I'm being honest. Like the Magnum TA sit down with David Crockett at the Sportatorium a few weeks back. Yeah, that was good. But as far as an actual 45-minute tribute dedicating everything solely to the life of David von Erich, this was one of the best tribute packages I've ever seen done. I learned so much about David in just that 45-minute window. It came across like an actual autobiography. But, it had all the home tapes and the stock footage, the match highlights, the interviews. It was a well-told story. A lot of information to be packed into that one. If you can find any means to go out of your way to watch it, highly recommend you do so. It's a great piece of business. One of the most brilliantly done tribute shows I've ever seen done. I really wish I would have gotten the chance to see David wrestle when he was still alive, man. because it would have given me more appreciation for him earlier on in my life when I had gone back and seen those old tapes of him. I just never had this kind of accessibility to the tape library to understand how much David really meant to the sport of wrestling. Not just in Dallas, but nationwide and globally. He was a true icon. Something we can never gloss over. But, well, I said this was going to be a long one. So let's kind of round things out here by getting to the end of this show so I can move on with my life and get the editing process going. Well, this weekend's going to be packed. We have the Retro Raw Report, SmackDown, and the AEW Revolution pay-per-view. We're going to try to get that all done in a reasonable length of time. No promises. But definitely come back to check out that show. You won't want to miss it. Thank you all for stopping in to check out this installment of the FSWR Report. Again, you can watch us on Rumble or YouTube, depending on what platform you prefer. And I guess we will be back on Monday to go over everything else. In the meantime, take care all. Peace out.